Okay, so let's take no prisoners here. Daniel, they let me call them by their first names. I'm not being disrespectful. Dr. Gordis, in your book, it comes up many times, and in my reading, it also was a recurring metaphor that essentially, if there was a marriage, or if there is a marriage between American Jews and Israeli Jews, we are right now a relationship on the rocks. Can you just give us a sense, and I'm just going to read a few of the examples as you cite them to give us to set the stage. Israeli diplomat Ilan Pincus said, U.S. Jewry just isn't that into Israel. American Jews, a New York Times headline said American Jews and Israeli Jews are heading for a messy breakup. And one rabbi said, I do not believe we can talk about a gap between Israel and the diaspora. It is now a canyon. So help us understand what happened to this marriage.
Well, that's the book, but it has been a bad marriage from the get-go. And if there's anything that I try to point out in the book that I think is kind of counterintuitive or counter to the convention, it is that this is not a love story that kind of went sour at a certain point. It was a very forced relationship from the get-go, which had a little brief period between 67 more or less and 82 of kind of love at first sight and love forever after, but it really never was that way. And I think one of the things that's important for us to understand is why that's really not surprising. And without going into all the detail now, we'll just say one thing about ways in which I think each community is both disappointed the other and ways in which the community's fundamental assumptions about the world and about the Jewish world are really radically different. So first of all, American Jews disappointed the Zionist movement in Europe and then in Palestine by not moving there. Right? I mean, this is not to say that my saying that they were right or wrong, but it's simply to say that David Ben-Gurion wrote in his diary, he never imagined that the hard part would be getting people to come, not getting the state. But they got the state, and then the only people that came, by and large, were those who lived in troubled places, and American Jews, quite rightly, felt very comfortable here and didn't come. So Zionists felt betrayed by that for a very long time, long before things got to where they are now. In the other direction, I think it's very important for Israelis to understand how complicated Zionism fundamentally is for American Jews. And I think Israelis don't give American Jews enough credit for the very difficult predicament in which Israel's existence places them. Just very quickly, 1915, President Woodrow Wilson's going around from naturalization ceremony to ceremony, saying to newly welcomed American immigrants, we want you all in, but you can't be Austrian American, Italian American, Polish American. You gotta be only American. That's 1915. Comes 1917, the Balfour Declaration, and Zionists and people in Europe and in Palestine look to American Jews and say, okay, now we're moving forward, let's make this happen. And American Jews were really in a very, very uncomfortable position. Do they thumb their nose at their Jewish brethren in Europe or at Woodrow Wilson? And they've tried, I think, quite admirably in many ways, to tiptoe around and to make what's a very uncomfortable relationship doable for a long time. But politics have changed, discourse has changed. People understand that there's no immediate apparent solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The rabbinate has gotten more entrenched. So fundamentally what's happened is that a rocky relationship from the start, because we've never talked about what really made that relationship rocky, has just gotten rockier and rockier, and now we find ourselves in crisis.
And we're going to go through all of those reasons, but before we get to the symptoms and even possibly a cure, can you just at least affirm or contextualize like, are we in a worse place? Would you say that this problem is unlike, is it an emergency, is a crisis? I think you used the word.
Well, it's an emergency or a crisis if you think the relationship matters. In other words, some people would say in a bad marriage, a divorce is actually a good thing. People can go on and live their lives and not be tethered by something that shouldn't exist anymore. I think the relationship matters a tremendous amount. And I think both parties would be selling themselves very short if they gave up on it. I'm going to say one thing very quickly about why I think that is. I think it's very important for American Jews to recognize that there has never, ever been a diaspora that has lasted forever. The Babylonian exile was the great diaspora, and it ended with the rise of Islam. The great age of Spain ended with the Inquisition. We all know what happened in Europe in the middle of the 20th century. Now, so far, things here are basically okay. There's warning signs and all that, but fundamentally, things here are okay. But we kind of assume this one's going to be fine. But why? Why would this diaspora break the rule of thousands of years of Jewish history and last forever? And if we're open to the possibility, because of a certain amount of epistemological humility, that it might not last, then do we not care that the other half of those 85% of the Jews who live in both places flourishes? I think we should. And Israelis ought to recognize that no sovereign Jewish entity in the land of Israel has ever lasted that long, actually. The kingdom of David and Solomon, with a little bit more after, basically was about an 80, 90-year truly independent entity. And the second sovereignty, the second commonwealth, call it whatever you want, was more or less also between 90 and 100 years, less than a century. We're 72 years in, and we've never lasted more than 100 years. Now, that's not to say that anything's going to change tomorrow, but it's to say that I think we all need to approach this with a certain degree of humility. Neither side, I think, has the right to assume that it's the side that's going to survive forever, because history says that's just not the case. And since we don't know which side is going to flourish and which side is going to struggle, it seems to me we need each other. We have a lot to learn from each other. We can talk about that over the course of the evening, but I think it's a crisis because the relationship does matter, and the biggest part of the crisis might be that people are beginning to say that it doesn't.
Tom, obviously there's a lot to respond to there, but I would like you to address whether you agree with the premise that we're in a very difficult place with this relationship.
First of all, thank you for having me, Danny. Good luck with the book. A shout out to Gary Rosenblatt, who's retiring, best Jewish editor in the country. And the relationship's gone up and down a lot over the years, over different issues, really since the Lebanon War in particular. But I would say if we're not in crisis, we're about to really be in crisis if the election is won by Prime Minister Netanyahu tomorrow. I think he's laid out for us in this campaign exactly what he intends to do. He intends to annex basically the Jordan Valley settlements and other settlements, which I believe will pretty well put the last of the nails in the coffin of any possibility of separation. Let's forget two states or just separation between Israelis and Palestinians. And he has told us that if he's elected, he is likely to be indicted, we know, on charges of corruption and fraud by Attorney General he appointed. And if that happens, he and his coalition partners will pass a law that exempts him from prosecution. And when the Israeli Supreme Court strikes down that law, the Israeli Knesset will make the Israeli Supreme Court subservient to him. And so from point of view of American Jews, I won't speak for all of them, but I speak for myself and who I represent, others who maybe share my views. We're talking about an Israel that will be, if you think BDS is a problem, it will be an Israel that will be facing the issue of one man, one vote from the Palestinian. The Palestinian cause will morph into a one man, one vote movement. And you can say it's disingenuous, you can say a lot of things about it, but if you think it's hard defending BDS on a college campus, try defending a rejection of one man, one vote. And Israel under Netanyahu that basically becomes an illiberal democracy in the way of Turkey, of Hungary, falls into that camp of banana republic because the government has passed a law exempting the prime minister from prosecution and then overruled the Supreme Court. I think that will tear apart every Jewish synagogue and institution in this country because the question will be, are you with that or not? It's not going to be whether you're with Israel versus the Palestinians. Are you with that kind of Jewish state or not? So I think it's a hackneyed cliche that this election is the most important of any election, but every once in a while, it's actually true.
You wrote, both Trump and Jews all over the world should pray that Bibi loses. And what struck me, and often strikes me about your columns, is that you, in a way, seem insulated from some of the accusations of not being, I have no doubt about your love for Israel when I read you. Maybe others would disagree with me, but that's where I think most readers stand. But that is not exactly the world we're living in, where you've kind of earned the trust of the reader of where you stand on Jews, on Israel, on the sort of the Jewish enterprise. But do you, I'm just curious, kind of feel like you're in different territory in terms of your kind of courage to say things that you know are, in a sense now, when we are so siloed, are you with us or against us? Does it give you pause?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've never been asked it that bluntly, actually. But I think, because I've been covering this issue for now 40 years, the most contentious issue for the New York Times. And, God bless some Jews, they think I'm just writing for them. I mean, they actually think I work for Gary and that I'm really working for the Jewish Week, not the New York Times. But believe it or not, I was just the speaker at the China Development Forum in Beijing last week. I was in Shenzhen,
were there Jews
Hong
there?
Kong, and there were no Jews there. And they actually didn't ask about Israel at all, okay?
Wow.
And I have a big following in the Arab Muslim world, pro and against. But I would just say a couple of things, Abby, that have served me well and maybe earned me that. I'm a big believer that to think and write about Israel properly and effectively as a journalist, that you actually have to hold three contradictory thoughts in your head at the same time. And that's very hard for a lot of people, but that's how my mind works. So I think to think about Israel is to first acknowledge that Israel is an amazing place. It's an amazing achievement. What the Jewish people have built in Israel by the way of society, absorption of Jews from all over the world, culture, technology, medicine, it's amazing. I took my family, both my daughters were born in Hadassah Hospital, and so I took my daughters and their sons-in-law, went on a trip to Israel, Ann and I, last year, and I hadn't been a tourist in Israel for a long time, and it was so much fun. Israel's an amazing place. Number two, Israel does bad stuff sometimes. Israel does bad stuff sometimes. And a documentary out right now, very heated, about the whole story of the Jewish terrorists. It's just a fact. It's a state. States do bad stuff sometimes. And lastly, Israel lives in a crazy neighborhood. Now, I happen to very easily hold those three thoughts in my head together at the same time. Unfortunately, some people just want to say, it's amazing. Israel just does bad stuff. It lives in a crazy neighborhood, leave them alone. No, it's actually all three, So that's the first thing I think readers have kind of intuited about me. And the second is, I'm the first Jewish reporter the New York Times ever sent to the Arab world. And they had a rule, you couldn't send a Jewish person to the Arab world.
To the Arab world.
To the Arab world. So I covered the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And I'd like to think under pretty difficult conditions as the only Jewish reporter in Beirut at a time that it was besieged by an Israeli army, that I wrote it pretty straight. And I think people appreciated that. But I didn't come to Israel kind of from Vietnam or Detroit or South America. So I had no illusions about the Arab world. I had a long record with them, too. If you think I'm controversial on Israel, come with me to the Arab world, okay? Gail Collins, my former editor, once came on a trip with me to the Middle East, and she said, going with Tom Friedman to the Middle East is like going to a mall with Britney Spears, okay? And, people will come up to you and they will tell you all kinds of things, believe me, and some of them not very, very, very pleasant. So I had no illusions about either side. And I'm pretty tough-minded about that. I'm not on Twitter. If you're out there talking about me, y'all have fun. I'm really focused on what I do. And my feeling is that you are what you do. And either your articles after 40 years stand up basically to scrutiny, that this guy's basically has believed the same thing for 40 years, that we need two states for two people, and the Arab world is going to die if it doesn't embrace gender pluralism, religious pluralism, education pluralism, and political pluralism. And that's kind of what I'm about there, and that's controversial, because I've done some things really controversial, support the Iraq War for democracy reasons, support MBS's initial initiatives on religious reform. But I kind of always have been working out of a framework of those two things. Are you for those two things? And that's the through line. And the last thing is, my dear friend Abe Foxman is here, friend of 57 years, my counselor at Herzl Camp in Webster, Wisconsin. I can tell you, and Abe and I, over the years, we kiss, we hug, we hit each other with our purses. But I don't let any Jewish or Arab organizations in my door, okay? Because you guys, God bless you, I know what you're doing, it's wonderful, but you're about politics and you're not about journalism. And take your politics somewhere else. So I am blessedly free of all of that. And that's how I survived.
So Daniel, I want to just go to the generational divide, because it's a pretty fundamental dynamic here that seems to be operating, and quote you when you say, "For today's younger American Jews, Israel is not a symbol of rebirth. How could it be when the Holocaust feels like ancient history? Think about it this way. The beginning of the Holocaust is already about half as long ago as the end of the American Civil War. And how emotional does anyone get when thinking about the Civil War? They have known nothing other than an Israel that is the, quote, startup nation, powerful, stable, seemingly invulnerable, but also in their minds, the reason that the Palestinians live such unfortunate lives. One generation has made all the difference."
So the question, I mean, I think it's very well written, but
Can you expand on it?
look, I think I'm going to come back to what Tom said before about the election tomorrow, because I think it'll lead us into that. And I want to begin, of course, by just saying once again how grateful I am to you for participating in this evening, and to Theo Wieseltier for all that she did to make it happen. It's an honor to be on the stage with you, and I'm grateful to you. I share Tom's dread about what might happen tomorrow. That is kind of the worst case scenario. He could get elected and some of those things might not happen. But yes, if all the stars align and all those things happen, then that is a very, very, very bad scenario. But what's interesting is what strikes me as tragic about it is not that it's going to rip every synagogue in America apart, which it might or might not, but that it destroys the dream that those of us who live there have worked to build. In other words, I think, frankly, all the collateral damage on this side of the Atlantic will be just that. It'll be collateral damage and it'll be sad, but what will be heartbreaking is what will be happening to the dream of the country that we're trying to build. And I think, therefore, that that's where people like Tom and I have a responsibility. Even if we disagree about some of the politics and about tomorrow, I think we don't disagree at all. But even if we disagree about some of the politics, I think we have a responsibility to try to shape that younger generation as best we can, and to try to bring them into the conversation as best we can. And where Tom and I disagree sometimes is actually not on the nuts and the bolts, but I think it's actually on the wordsmithing. And obviously, you take home a few Pulitzers, nobody's going to argue that you're not an exceptionally excellent wordsmith. But for example, when Beirut to Jerusalem came out, there wasn't a lot in there factually that I thought wasn't exactly right, but I can't bring myself, even though I agree with you that Israel does some very bad things, I can't bring myself to say about Israel that it's Yad Vashem with jet fighters. I understand what you mean, and it's not
Wait, Danny, can you explain what you just meant?
Yad Vashem with an Air Force.
Yad Vashem with an Air Force. Okay, I think jet fighters and Air Force is close, but okay. Yad Vashem with an Air Force, meaning that the memory of the Holocaust weighs so darkly over Israel that you couple that to profound military power, and you get what happened in 1982 with Begin and the invasion of Lebanon and so forth. I mean, Begin obviously understood that that was a disastrous mistake. It cost him his life. It cost him certainly his career, but I think it also cost him his life at the end of the day. Certainly those last years of... In other words, I think that if you and I disagree about anything, it's how do we bring that younger generation in? And I think more people of our generation need to be saying, not that Israel does bad things, because everybody knows that, and it's true, and we both say it, so there's no reason not to. And everybody understands that the neighborhood is a terrible neighborhood. I'm going to come back to that in 1 minute. But the extraordinary accomplishment of what's been created simply goes unmentioned far too often. The mere fact, by the way, that there's going to be an election tomorrow is an extraordinary thing. It's a country, the vast majority of people who moved to it moved from places where there was no democracy, whether it was North Africa or the Soviet Union or whatever it was. And you can bite your tongue tomorrow, God forbid, but there's every reason to believe that it'll be a peaceful election, that it'll be an orderly election, and that the person who gets the most votes will be declared the winner, something that not all countries always do. But in any event, and we don't even have an electoral college. So I'm very worried about the young generation in America, but I think it's our responsibility to try to have them understand that the Jewish world is still very fragile. Here's what I would actually say about America and Israel. This isn't actually at all in the book, but maybe it should have been. I think that both communities are actually still in the stages of recovering from the middle of the 20th century. They're both brand new. In 1880, the combined Jewish populations of the United States and what was then Palestine was 275,000 people. That was 3% of the Jewish world in 1880. It's now 86% of the Jewish world. That means from a perspective of Jewish history, both of these communities are really brand new. And they're both radical experiments and ways of trying to reimagine a Jewish future in the light of the loss of what had been the model of Jewish living for 600-700 years in the middle of Europe. Israelis got a lot of things right in a very bad neighborhood and doing some bad things, no question, but have never really quite figured out how to let this huge dilemma of the captured territories in '67 not rip the country apart, and we may be actually reaping the terrible harvest of that inability to decide tomorrow. And yet it's an amazing accomplishment. American Jewish life is an extraordinary accomplishment that may be on the verge of actually becoming much, much, much smaller because of the radical and unprecedented level of Jewish illiteracy in this country. No one's written by that, I think, about that more effectively than Leon Wieseltier, whose sister is sitting here in the front row. But Leon has really written incredibly effectively about the dangers of that kind of illiteracy. I think both countries are incredible accomplishments. Both countries face very serious existential threats. And both have to make some very, very, very smart decisions. I think if we could get a younger generation of American Jews to understand that despite the conflict, which I think Israel does not have, we probably don't agree about that, but I don't think Israel has any great moves on the chessboard right now, and I think that's partly what Israelis are going to vote about tomorrow. It's our responsibility to get that younger generation to understand that Israel's not as solid as they think, it's not as permanent as they imagine, it's not as evil as they imagine, that the plight of the Palestinians, which is terrible, is mostly not Israel's doing. That, I think, is the conversation that we'll have to begin to have with them before it's too late and we lose them.
I just want to circle back to one of the things you've in your list of 3 things, you said Israel sometimes does bad things, and you are also positing that is true. But I want to circle back to it because I actually don't think we're as comfortable, particularly as a Jewish community, of saying that as if it's a given. And in fact, those of us who love Israel sometimes don't know the language that we can use to explore our discomfort about certain things. And I'm talking about the every Jew, not Abby personally. But let's talk about pluralism for a minute, because this is one of the sort of in the bad category, is that those of us, I'm a member of Central Synagogue with Angela Buchdahl, we have Rabbi Josh Davidson here. When we hear the chief rabbinate refer to Reform Jews as akin to Holocaust deniers, when we hear that we are not real Jews, which is their language, it's hard, and I want to start with you, Tom, because I know you've addressed this, and I just want to quote you. It's hard for us to feel seen, included, and not even that we're sort of, stomping off, taking it personally, but this is a country we send buses to and planes to and money to, and we feel like it's our home, too. And there's a sense that our Judaism actually isn't legitimate. Tom, you said you can't tell American Jews, we want you to come to Israel, but your form of Jewish religious expression is unacceptable to us. So, Tom, let's just start with and whether you see this as actually a real kind of disease or illness, or in terms of the disaffection that American Jews are feeling, how much does it matter?
Danny has more value add on this than me because I don't write about it very much. I happen to have a sister who's Lubavitch, okay? Was Jose B'Tshuva, and so I actually met the Rebbe at the Rebbe, back when they got engaged. I tell you that to say, I'm like not uncomfortable in that world. I'm not uncomfortable being looked down on a little bit in that world. I don't take that all that seriously, only because I know how secular many Israelis are. I know Danny was talking before about his kids, and he can talk about himself, but life, how conservative and Reformed Jews, okay, maybe they can't get officially recognized as married, but they still get married, they still do things. There's a very healthy Jewish life. My teacher, Rabbi David Hartman, ran a flourishing institute in Israel, still does. And so I think it's an important issue, but those Jewish wars have been with us, I mean, ever since, the first and second temples. So I don't, because I'm not steeped in that world. For me, the issue is more, the pluralism issue is something I write about much more with the Arab Muslim world. I actually, I don't really give interviews anymore because they always end up with the charge sheet. I was just in London, and my British publisher asked me if I would do an interview, and I said, I really don't want to do this, but it was a British publication. Talked me into it, and it always ends with the charge sheet. Whatever the subject is.
Charge sheet.
The charge sheet is you supported the Iraq War, you supported MBS's reforms, and you were too excited about the Arab Spring. And so literally a journalist said that to me, and I was actually getting up at the end of the interview. I said, that's such a big question. Can I email you an answer? And so I sent him back an answer. I said, think of what you just asked me. You said I was too excited to get rid of one Arab dictator. I was too willing to tolerate another Arab dictator. And I was way too excited about the prospect of getting rid of all the Arab dictators. Now, either I'm completely messed up, okay, or you don't see the through line here. And the through line for me is, remember, I spent actually much more time covering the Arab world than I do Israel. And the through line for me is, wherever I saw a chance to open the door of pluralism in that part of the world, I got behind it. Because guess what? Perfect is not on the menu, all right? And so every time I saw a crack, maybe we can partner with Iraqis to bring some kind of multicultural pluralism to this place, albeit as crazy as that may seem. Actually, Iraq is doing amazing stuff today, by the way, but don't tell anybody, okay? After its third, free and fair election. Maybe we can open the crack in Saudi Arabia to a little religious and gender pluralism, and maybe we could open a crack across the Arab world to it. Because if the Arab world doesn't find its way to gender pluralism, education pluralism, political pluralism, it's actually going to die. It's going to go over a cliff, and Israel is going to be surrounded by complete and utter fauda. So I came to this, again, because of all the important stories in my life, actually, as an American, was 9/11. 9/11 had a huge impact on me, as it did everybody, and I happened to be in Israel on 9/11. And my take on 9/11 was that for years, America had treated the Arab world as a collection of just big gas stations. There was Saudi station, Iraq station, Kuwait station, UAE station, Morocco station, Algeria station. And our message to them was very simple. It was guys, because it was only guys. Guys, here's the deal. Keep your pumps open, your price is low, and don't bother the Yehudis too much. And you can do whatever you want out back. You can treat your women however you like. You can preach whatever crazy conspiracy theories from your newspapers that you like. You can preach whatever intolerance from your mosques that you like. You can miseducate your kids as much as you like. Just keep your pumps open, your price is low, and don't bother the Jews too much. And my view, Abby, was that on 9/11, we got hit with the distilled essence of all the pathologies going on out back. And ever since 9/11, my personal crusade and project has been wherever I could find support and get behind cracks of pluralism in that part of the world, I got behind it. I took all the criticism. I never did Hashamnu Hatamnu, please let me write for the liberal press again, okay? I know just what I was doing, why I was doing it. I was a consenting adult, and I would do it again.
Okay. Danny. I've heard a lot that the Kotel, the wall controversy really doesn't matter that much to Israelis. but there is some symbolism of something greater, of a greater issue for American Jews. Can you address kind of how that played out? You actually do use the word reneged, that Bibi had a deal reneged, so you're not backing off the fact that that was a flip-flop. How much does it matter, do you think?
Well, it matters a lot, and it doesn't matter at all, right? It doesn't matter at all because there is, and I was opposed to it, and I think the most fiery thing...
You were opposed to which?
I was opposed to was reneging, and I think I have a rule, generally speaking, when I write a column, it's either sleep on it or show it to my wife.
I have the same rule. She's right there.
The best policy is to do both. And there's been very few times when I've done neither, and I've always regretted it, because it's usually greeted with something like, okay, we still have 4 friends left. You don't want them either? So when the Kotel thing happened, I just took out a good bottle of scotch and started pounding away at the keyboard and wrote something that was really incredibly stupid, and which I've paid the price for since then. But I was enraged, because I thought it was really a terrible thing to do. Having said that, the person who explains this best, and I quote her in the book, is Einat Wilf. Einat Wilf is a progressive, left-of-center, very smart, BA from Harvard, MA from Oxford, PhD from the Sorbonne, it's not a bad start, former member of Knesset, who loves to say the following because it just gets people's blood pressure going very, very high. She says, why does she not care about the whole Kotel thing? Why did she, as a leftist who hates Bibi, not get upset? She said, why would I really care who can pray where at the bottom of a foundation wall that was built to a temple to worship a God who doesn't exist? Now, it's a little in your face, but she's Israeli. But the reason that it doesn't matter is because it matters a tremendous amount. Don't get me wrong. It matters. He was wrong. You should honor your commitments. You should live up to the promises that you make. And for American Jews, including me, who wrote that column, it was incredibly infuriating. Having said that, the battle over religious pluralism in Israel is being waged on the street, not at the Kotel. I live a 15, 20-minute walk from the Kotel. I don't think I've been there in 15 years. No, and that's not an exaggeration, neither side. I live about a 20-minute walk, and I'm sure I haven't been there in 15 years. What would I go there for? It's an ultra-Orthodox synagogue, and I'm not an ultra-Orthodox Jew. They took it over, we let them have it, and so on and so forth. What matters in Israel is religious pluralism. And the place where I go to shul Friday night, which is a congregation that's run by a woman named Tamar Elad Applebaum, who I think is one of the most creative rabbis in the world, and who's definitely my own rabbi, has Orthodox people and conservative people and Reform people, and women with, tattoos on their shoulders and guys with payas. I'm not making this up. They all daven together Friday night. Some over here and some over there, but we come together and we sing. That's where the people who want to stop the Kotel integration are going to lose the battle. They're going to lose the battle on the streets. And that's why when I say it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter. We were talking before about my son's wedding. I'm sorry we didn't invite all of you, but we really wanted to. But he got married 2 or 3 weeks ago in Israel. I did the wedding. I'm a conservative rabbi. I'm not only not registered with the rabbinate, it's against the law. It's a violation of the law for me to perform that wedding in Israel. I did it in front of many photographers and hundreds of people, and I could have been arrested. As you saw a few months ago, some conservative rabbi in Haifa was arrested. My attitude is, first of all, if there's Wi-Fi and no faculty meetings, I'm guilty. Take me, right? I'll catch up on my inbox. But much more importantly, somebody's got to stand up to these people. And it's not me who's being courageous, it's my kids who are being courageous, who basically said, we're not going to be registered as a married couple, and we'll deal with whatever those consequences are. There's not a lot, but we'll deal with them. That's why when I say it doesn't matter, I think it doesn't matter, because the battle's not going to get won in their backyard. Let me come back to one other thing that you guys were talking about a minute ago, when we say Israel does bad things. So the pluralism thing is a bad thing, and Israel needs to get better at it, and in the places where it matters, Israel's getting a lot better at it. You just have to know what's going on in neighborhoods and in synagogues and in communities to see what's going on. In a mile of my house, there's Pardes, which is an egalitarian yeshiva, and it's the Israel Democracy Institute, which is actually an important font of democratic ideas in Israel, and Shalem College, where I work, which is a copy of American four-year colleges, only we still actually allow a difference of opinion among students and so on and so forth. In other words, there's a tremendous amount of good stuff happening. So when we say that Israel does bad stuff, and I think that we're actually putting the wrong spin on it. I'll give you an example of, I think, the ways in which it's not okay to explain the bad stuff that Israel does, because sometimes what looks like bad stuff isn't bad stuff. It's sad stuff, but it's not bad stuff. So the day that the embassy moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, meaning the day they put up a plaque in Jerusalem and moved absolutely nothing, but it doesn't matter. The day that the embassy moved, as you're very well aware, there was a tremendous amount of fighting along the Gaza border, and 60-something young Palestinians were killed, most of them by Israeli snipers. You have to have a heart of stone for your heart not to break at that fact. I don't care if you're right, you're left, you're religious, you're secular, you're Jewish, doesn't matter. 60-something kids died along that fence on that Friday, and it's a horrible, horrible, I think it was a Friday, I'm not sure. It was a horrible, horrible thing. But the Forward put out an article a couple days later, written by Peter Beinart. I didn't agree with the column, it wasn't a terrible column, he and I debate each other all the time. I didn't agree, so what? But the headline, which he did not write, very important to say, he did not write the headline, said, and I'm quoting it verbatim, Israel's decision to shoot Palestinians should not surprise us, but should still horrify us. That's not okay. Because defending the Gaza border from people, it's like a chain link fence like you would put up if you lived out in Westchester and you wanted to put up a fence between your house and then some places it's more sophisticated and in some places it's a wall and in a lot of places it's just a chain link fence. And how do you know that? Because you see in the news that Israel caught people who got through it. It's just a fence. And if that fence gets pushed over by 10 kids or 50 kids or 100 kids, and then 500 people come across the fence and 1,000 people come across the fence, and with all the kibbutzim and moshavim standing around there, you have a bloodbath on your hands. So Israel has had a policy ever since '67, and especially since 2005, that border is defended with lethal force. Now, you can have a very good argument about whether the blockade is a good idea or a bad idea. You can have a very good conversation about whether sending building materials into Gaza when too much of them gets used for building tunnels is a good idea or a bad idea. You can have an argument about whether or not citizens of Gaza who elected Hamas should actually take some steps on their own to overthrow Hamas. Those are all legitimate conversations. But when a leading American Jewish newspaper says, Israel's decision to shoot Palestinians should not surprise us, that is a condemnation of the Jewish state, which no Jew ought to be party to, because it's just a matter of the Jewish state trying to keep its citizens safe. And that's an example, by the way, where something was terribly sad, but I don't think it was bad. And I think we have to actually then have a gradation of what's sad, what's bad, what's really violent, what's about religious pluralism. These things can't all get put into one hopper if we're going to have a serious conversation.
Okay. Since you've now gotten us seamlessly into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you write, Israel's conduct of its conflict with the Palestinians upsets, angers, and embarrasses American Jews. What appear to be periodic internal assaults on Israel's democratic values also worry American Jews deeply. So let's just put that example aside with the article. And I actually do, even though the quote from the book is the entry here. Obviously, Tom Friedman, you've written a lot about this conflict. Can you this is one of the places where particularly young American Jews on campuses are seeing something that may be very simplistic, that may be ill-informed, but they see a human rights crisis. They see Israel as an oppressor. So I know it's a huge topic that could take up weeks, let alone the minutes we have here. But can you help us understand where you think that is right now in terms of what young people are deciding about Israel as a power that they do not see as vulnerable and that they do see as abusing that power?
Well, I'm not an expert I don't spend much time on college campuses, so I'm not an expert on that subject. I just know a few things. I have two daughters, obviously, and who are involved, politically. I would say I find, to the extent I'm on college campuses, young Americans young Democrats are increasingly woke on two issues, BDS and MBS. Bibi Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Salman better hope that Donald Trump is reelected. Because if you get a liberal, progressive Democrat as President of the United States that is influenced by and influencing where the mood is among young Democrats today, I think you could get a very discontinuous relationship between the United States and Israel. So let's start there.
I just want to understand what you mean by they're woke on those two.
I think that there's a lot of energy behind the BDS movement and behind sort of hostility toward MBS, Saudi Arabia, post the despicable murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and the fact that Trump has not brought any censure to Saudi Arabia on that. So I think both countries, Trump is protecting them, I think, from a lot of democratic, progressive hostility on these issues. You know, my whole life on this, I've seen both sides do really bad stuff. And it's very true, Danny, on the question of the Gaza border. That's the easy one, though. Israel has a right to defend itself. You charge the border, we're gonna take you down. And I've never had any illusions about that. I was the probably only columnist in the world, including Israeli columnists, who defended Prime Minister Olmert in his war against Hezbollah and the extremely aggressive tactics that he took. In fact, so much so that he read my column from the Knesset floor, okay? And that column, again, came out of my feeling that there are actually only two non-Muslim tribes that have survived as independent entities in the Arab world. And they're called the Jews and the Kurds. And the reason the Jews and the Kurds have survived in that giant sea is because they will, at the end of the day, play by the local rules. And the local rules are what I call Hama rules. And Hama rules are no rules at all. And the message Israel sent in 2006 to Hezbollah, which has still had an effect on them till today, is you will not out-crazy us. Okay? So it's that kind of neighborhood. I don't celebrate that. I'm just here to tell you that it had an effect, because you'll remember Nasrallah said 2 weeks after the war ended, had I known then what I know now, I never would have started the war. It's that kind of neighborhood. Those are the easy ones for me. The harder ones are expropriation of Palestinian land in the West Bank, really ugly stuff. In Palestinian universities, limiting, science courses. Yes, I know they can make bombs from things, but some of this stuff, limiting their telephone service. There's just a lot of daily indignities that go on that really aren't pleasant, aren't necessary, and aren't the matter of just standing at the border, me and you, defending myself. So I think we should distinguish that. I'm all with you on the Gaza border. I see you Gaza border, and I raise you one, because I told you on the Lebanon war, I was in a completely different place from the Israeli press corps, let alone the world press corps. It's an advantage, again, having come to Israel from the Arab world. I have no illusions, okay? Now, for young people today, though, what I try to get through to them is really where I started at. This is a complicated reality in a complicated neighborhood. And my point all along, the reason I don't participate in these debates is I live by the motto, do you want to make a point or do you want to make a difference? I could make points about Israel, good and bad, Palestinians, good and bad, till I'm blue in the face. And my philosophy is I'm only interested in making a difference. And that's where all my columns are directed. Who's got a new idea? How do we connect these people? That's where the Arab Peace Initiative came from, okay? It was to give King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia an idea of how to push this thing forward. I'm just not into sitting in judgment on either side. I'm entirely focused, are you, in whatever you're engaged in, bringing people together? And you may have noticed I'm probably the only columnist in America who took on Ilhan Omar. And why was that? Because of all the gin joints, Ilhan Omar is my congresswoman. She represents my little town of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, okay? And St. Louis Park is a freaky place. I wrote about it in my last book because I grew up and went to Hebrew school with, at the same time, with the Coen brothers, Al Franken, Norm Ornstein, Michael Sandel, Peggy Ornstein, Sharon Isbin. We all went through the same Hebrew school and high school. This was not a neighborhood in the Upper West Side. This was a little Jewish town in Minnesota. We, the frozen chosen of that place, okay? And who turns out to be our congresswoman today? But Ilhan Omar. And her attitude is who turns out to be the New York Times foreign affairs columnist, but Tom Friedman, who came from here. And my critique of her has had nothing to do with Israel, her issues. My critique is that you represent the biggest concentration of Jews and Muslim Somalis living together in one congressional district, probably anywhere in America. And you were designed to be a bridge builder. And you've been a bridge destroyer. Shame on you. That's my critique.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
I think it also begs the question of how you responded to them barring her from coming to Israel, which...
Well, I'd like to address that. And I thought that was just, I don't know I can't find strong enough language. Is boneheaded good? I mean, it's just like, when did we get so afraid? When did we get so afraid? By the way, even about the BDS thing, some guy at the airport Googling you when you come in, did you say something about BDS? Let them come in, let them go everywhere. I would have said, come, go anywhere you want. If you happen to have a few minutes on your last day, let me take you to a school in North Tel Aviv. Because you may not know this, but we actually have DACA kids here. They're from Darfur. Okay? Because we got 60,000 Darfuris and South Sudanese refugees who walked to Israel, not for the kosher food. They just wanted the security of the place, okay? And my friend, Yossi Vardi has actually funded a school there for these kids, just if you got a few minutes, at the end. I'd like to show you that school. If you got a few more minutes, I'd like you to introduce you to some fellow Africans. They're Ethiopian Jews. They're here. They're integrated. They'll tell you about their struggles, their toils, their successes, okay? If you happen to have a few minutes. And if you don't, you know what? Don't really care. Go home, say whatever you want. We're going to be fine.
Part of what I think it was the most striking to me in your book is that you're trying to make us realize this is not so much about what Israel does, but what Israel is. And you frame that by saying they're very different projects. That American democracy, Israeli democracy, and even the idea of each country is really a different enterprise. Can you explain? We don't have a lot of time, but just so we can understand, because through this prism that Tom was just addressing, it's not really a universalist perspective, right? It is a particularistic country. And how do we balance that? How do American Jews understand that it's a democracy, but there's a certain people that's getting something that others aren't?
Right. Well, okay. I would think that one way of looking at it is just simply to look at the Emma Lazarus poem at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, right? Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry. And she goes on, your teeming masses yearning to breathe free. That's what made America great. If you wanted to be part of this project and you believed in infinite human potential, and you wanted to be part of this experiment that was going to take over the world, many people thought, and for a while it seemed like it was going to, in radical human self-government and so forth, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender, regardless of your ethnicity or religion or whatever, then come to this country. Give me you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, teeming masses yearning to breathe free. What does the Balfour Declaration say? His Majesty's government view with favor misspelled, but whatever. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It's an entirely different thing. Thomas Jefferson wrote, when in the course of human events, not white events, not male events, not Christian events, not European events, not free people's events, when in the course of human events is how the American Declaration of Independence begins, whereas Israel's Declaration of Independence begins, in the land of Israel, the Jewish people was born. The United States is a liberal democracy, the purpose of which was to model for the world a form of self-government which would be attentive to virtually limitless human potential, regardless of what your origins were. And despite all of its many flaws, this country has lived up to that promise for many millions of people in very many significant ways. Israel has a very different purpose. Israel was meant to save the Jewish people. Period. Of course it was going to have a non-Jewish minority, and of course it was going to face challenges of democracy and the Jewish ethnicity being in the center. But fundamentally, the Statue of Liberty beckoning to all people from all over the world, no matter what, to come here and build their lives anew, is very, very different from Israel, where it's fundamentally about saving the Jewish people, at which it has also succeeded. And one could go on in lots of other differences, but I'll just give you a couple. I mean, Saul Bellow, when he wrote Humboldt's Gift, has a great line towards the very, very beginning of the book, and he describes the central character of von Humboldt, and he's an Eastern European Jew from Crimea, and he's come to America, and he says Bellow, that Humboldt thought that history was a nightmare, and he'd come to America to get a good night's rest. It's a great line. That's why he also got a Pulitzer and a Nobel. Israel did not create itself so the Jews could get a good night's rest from the messiness of history. No, it didn't. In fact, if you look at early Zionist writers in the beginning of the 20th century, it was about embracing the messiness, the muddiness, the yuckiness of history, because they felt that's the only way the Jews are not going to be pawns. The Jews are there's going to be one place where Jews are going to actually defend themselves. There's going to be one place where Jews are going to actually be certain that no matter what happens, they're going to be the dominant majority. They're going to be the ethnicity that shapes the nature of the culture. And you can't have that, said those Zionist thinkers, unless you're willing to get involved in the messiness of history. American Jews can vote Republican, they can vote Democrat, but American Jews as American Jews don't have a foreign policy. They vote for foreign policy views, understandably. But Israelis have to have a foreign policy because, unlike Humboldt, they've chosen to get involved. So there's a universalist versus a particularist. There's a kind of a recess from history to a certain extent, as opposed to really embracing the messiness of history. Judaism in America is fundamentally a religion. You may or may not go to shul, but that's the question, do you or do you not go? Whereas in Israel, there's a kind of a very thin line that's evaporating now between religious rituals and national rituals. Judaism in Israel has become a national entity, much more than it's become a kind of a religious enterprise. The point of all of this, to go back to the very, very, very first question, is why are we in the position that we're in? Because the two countries are radically different. They were created for radically different purposes. And in those two countries, radically different kinds of Jewish life have sprouted up. And yet, because this is still, despite all of its stumbling these days, because this is still the greatest democracy on planet Earth, we have an implicit assumption that Israel should basically be a Hebrew-speaking, falafel-eating version of the United States of America. And every time Israel does something that America would not do, Israel stumbled. And the more Israel models America, the better it's doing. I'm going to say something about tomorrow's vote with that in mind. We agree tomorrow, we agree about what we would like to see tomorrow, I think. Well, we certainly about what we don't want to see tomorrow. Okay? But you have to understand how the attack on Saudi Arabia helps Bibi Netanyahu. In a very big way, the not sophisticated, not the New York Times reader, not the Haaretz reader, but the reader of some other newspaper in Israel. Other newspapers, there's plenty of them, because we have freedom of the press, actually. They look at that and they say, oh my God, Iran, whether from here or from there, it doesn't matter. They just hit Saudi Arabia and could be causing international turmoil in the oil markets. From very far away with these drones that you could almost buy at Radio Shack, not quite, but you could almost buy at Radio Shack. Now, we know a few weeks ago that they tried to actually swarm Israel with drones, and we were able to prevent it. That voter gets into bed the night before the election, like right now. It's the middle of the night, and the polls are going to open in a few hours, and they say to themselves, at the end of the day, all the corruption, all the ugliness, all the baiting of the Arab population, all the cavorting with all of these right-wing, unappealing Eastern European leaders and all of that, if Iran does the same thing to us that it did to Saudi Arabia this week, who do I want in that office? And a lot of Israelis are going to hold their noses and vote for the guy who's now been prime minister longer than anyone else because he has deftly negotiated the problems with Putin and with Syria and with Turkey and with Donald Trump. Everybody understands that not letting Omar in was a ridiculously boneheaded thing to do. My read of it is that actually Israel was going to let them in. That seemed to be what it was bubbling up. And then Trump tweeted that it would be a sign of great weakness if Israel allowed them to come in. Bibi Netanyahu has one policy position which he never varies from when it comes to dealing with the United States these days. It is do not get on the wrong side of a vindictive, egotistical, ignorant, unstable president of the United States. Now, again, it was a ridiculous, taken out of context, out of that particular context, not letting Omar in was a ridiculous thing to do. She wouldn't have gone to those schools, I agree with you. She wouldn't have gone to Yad Vashem, I agree with you. She would have gone to see what she wanted to see. She would have written what she wanted to write. And hundreds of people have done it before her, and hundreds of people will do it afterwards, and we've survived them, we would have survived her. Bibi, rightly or wrongly, to go back to the rules of the neighborhood, made a choice. I don't want to wake up on the wrong side of this guy's opinion in the morning because there's too much at stake. Now, again, we don't have to like what he did. All I'm saying is that there's a matter of trying to understand this from the position in which Israelis are looking at the world, which is a somewhat frightened position, both of us because of what's happening in the Middle East and, quite frankly, because of what's happening in Washington, D.C. as well.
Tom, you wrote, I am going to say this as simply and clearly as I can. If you're an American Jew, and you're planning on voting for Donald Trump because you think he is pro-Israel, you're a damn fool. So, I'm hearing a lot of Jews say, he's with us, he's for us, and he moved the embassy, and he threw out the Iran deal, and he's gonna, again, protect Jews. So, help us understand the confusion and your certainty.
I couldn't say it any more clearly than that. I don't have close relations with this administration, obviously. But a senior official did call me, Abby, the day they moved the embassy. Announced that they're moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Picked up the phone. Hi, Tom. Just want you to know, we moved the embassy today from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. I said, oh, really? What did you get? Dead silence. I said, no. Don't tell me you gave it away for free. There are certain diplomatic assets that we have to sweeten, advance, some kind of two states for two people solution. The idea that he gave it away for free, and of course he didn't give it away for free. He got a huge check from Sheldon Adelson, and he's running for Jewish votes in Florida. But it had nothing to do with the interests of the United States of America, in my view, or advancing the peace process or any hope of a solution. If you care about Israel, in my view, you care to keep open the prospects of separation. Now, I've covered a lot of American administrations, and there's one thing I've learned about the critical role of the United States in the Middle East, because all these governments are full of centrists, softliners, and really crazy extremists. And the role the American president has always played is that when that cabinet meeting was happening, and some extremists brought up some crazy idea, the Prime Minister of Israel could always say, I am with you. Oh, I am so with you. But the American president broke my arm. He broke my arm. He would never let me do it. I'm with you. But the Americans will never let me do it. And I'll tell you, there's one conversation that never happened in Saudi Arabia when someone said, I've got a good idea. Let's abduct and murder Jamal Khashoggi. And there's the same in Israel when someone says, let's annex settlements, okay? No one today is saying, but what will Donald Trump say, okay? Because they think he's going to give them a blank check, because Donald Trump does not care about Israel or the Jewish people. Donald Trump cares about getting reelected. Okay? That's all he cares about. And trust me, if to get reelected, he needs to do a deal with Rouhani, as he's already twice invited the president of Iran. Believe me, he will do that deal. I don't think it is pro-Israel. It is pro-Israel to basically stand back and let extremists in the Israeli cabinet settle beyond the Green Line, now 104,000 settlers, so there will be no possibility of separation between Israelis and Palestinians, and Israel will default to a binational state. That is not the Jewish state I aspire to see. I don't think that's the Jewish state Herzl wanted to see, but that is the Jewish state that we will get if you don't have an American president who loves Israel. You know, everyone said Obama was this hater of Israel. It was so dishonest. He cared about a liberal, democratic Israel. And in the end, he just gave up. He just said, hey, whatever, okay? These people don't want you. So now you got Donald Trump, and he's going to write you one blank check after another until he doesn't, until you get in his way. And when that happens, watch out, because this guy will turn on anyone, okay, if his political survival is at stake. And I totally agree with Danny. Bibi understands that. They've had actually a rough 2 weeks if you've followed what's been going on between Trump and Netanyahu as Trump has been reaching out to Rouhani. And I totally agree with Danny. My first reaction to the strike on Saudi Arabia was, that's really going to help Bibi. And by the way, for legitimate reasons, because it's a crazy neighborhood.
How do you know that there's a God? Because we finally disagreed about something. I agree with 90% of that. But I just want to say about the embassy, every sovereign country has a right to say where its capital is. And if the United States, there's a lot of things that I agree with you about, that the president should be the person that the Israeli prime minister can say, I wouldn't be able to get away with that. And I think right here that Trump's not being that role is 100% correct. We agree about all of that. But on the embassy, the one issue that we don't agree is, I think that for a long time, you all know, by the way, that the law was passed basically that the embassy should move to Jerusalem, and then each president kind of had to pass legislation to temporarily delay it. And of course there were kinds of tit-for-tats and quid pro quos that people wanted to get in America, but this was actually one time where even, you know, a broken clock is right twice a day. This was one time when it was actually the right thing to do. The sovereign state of Israel decided a very long time ago that it wanted its capital to be in the city of Jerusalem, and it has a right to decide that. It never said that its capital was going to be in East Jerusalem. It made it very clear that it was in West Jerusalem. And I'll give you the following little indication of how well we know that actually nobody in Israel was upset, including Israeli Arabs and including Arabs who are not Israeli Arabs, the way that American Jews were. When Israel was going to put magnometers, whatever they're called, these metal detectors outside the Temple Mount, the city almost burnt down. It came this close to rioting. And Israel finally backed down because it understood that if the Arabs from East Jerusalem took to the streets, there was going to be no putting this down. Do you know what Arabs from East Jerusalem did on the day that the embassy moved? They went to work. They didn't do anything. They've understood for a very, very, very long time that the embassy is a non-issue. They care about a lot of other issues. They'll care about annexation. They care about the Jordan River Valley. They care about a lot of different kinds of things, as well they should. But the embassy was one instance, I think, where Trump actually, for whatever reason, got it right. Because he said basically sovereign countries have a right to decide where their embassies go. Israel's wanted it there for a very long time. It's high time that the world treated Israel the way it treats every other country on the planet.
I agree it was a non-issue for Palestinians.
Sorry, say it again.
I agree it was a non-issue for Palestinians, but it was an issue for Israelis. And therefore, it was an asset in negotiations, which we gave away for free.
Okay. So I'm going to give you each a last word. I want to actually start with you, Tom. There is a certain fatigue around Israel, I think, that some American Jews feel. They are not like us reading everything and feeling like they're staying in this conversation because they care so much. They feel a little bit like it's too complicated, and it's too bottomless, and it also feels too pessimistic. So what would be your answer, whether they're young or old, to just, again, why sort of not to give up?
You know, first of all, Danny, thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm going to go buy his book as soon as everyone else here should, okay?
I bet he'll give it to you.
It doesn't matter if you read it as long as you buy it.
Exactly right. And Abby, thank you. So I was in Beijing a week ago. And I was, I'm not making this up, it just happened. I was driving to the airport. I got to Beijing airport. And just as I was coming in, an El Al plane landed. It was coming in. I'm watching El Al plane land. And I just thought, what an amazing time to be alive as a Jew in this era of the Jewish state, where an El Al plane flies from Tel Aviv to Beijing. And I still get a buzz out of that. Okay? And what I know about that fatigue, I feel it sometimes myself, but I never feel it when I'm in Israel. And what does worry me most is that, I met Abe Foxman at Herzl Camp in Webster, Wisconsin in 1962. We reenacted the Dreyfus trial every summer. And twice I was the French officer who got to rip his epaulets off and break his sword. Okay? Israel had me at hello. It's whatever you think, folks, don't worry, okay? In times of crisis, I know where I will be, when the Jewish state is under threat. But I worry about, I'm 66, I've been the foreign affairs columnist for 21 years. What about the next generation? Will the next foreign affairs columnist, we got David Brooks, we got Brett Stevens, we're all sort of the same generation, one that's socialized in a different era. Will they get that buzz when they see an El Al plane landing in Beijing? And that's what worries me.
Thank you. Danny.
So I also want to thank Tom and definitely join with him in thanking you for an extraordinary job this evening and for shepherding this conversation. I assume you knew it was an El Al plane because you could see everybody standing up even as it was landing. Well, they fly low. Look, here's what worries me. What worries me is like that proverbial couple that has long since been on the rocks. We have never really talked about what really separates us. And what separates us is not the Kotel. It's important, but that's not what we were arguing about in 1960 when Israel captured Eichmann, and it's not what we were arguing about in 1950 when the AJC and Ben Gurion had a huge blow up and so on and so forth. These two communities have been at each other's throats for a very long time. We don't know that history. We have to understand that history so we can understand how extraordinarily accomplished both are, how threatened both are, and how we need each other more than anything else. What I was trying to do in the book is to create the platform for a conversation, which is why it has to come out in Hebrew too, and is actually coming out in Hebrew, because there's no point going to adult therapy if only one person's going. Right? We have to have this conversation because we desperately need each other. I also worry about that younger generation. And I worry about a younger generation that is woke about a whole bunch of things, but is not woke about the fact that gays and lesbians are being executed in Gaza, and in the West Bank they're definitely not treated well, and in Israel they just have bars and serve as officers in the army. I'd like to know where the American Jewish leadership is pointing that kind of thing out. But most importantly, I don't think that Jewish people have the luxury of saying about the other huge Jewish community in the world, and there's only two left, that's just the reality. It's the United States and Israel, as we said, it's 85, 86%. I don't think anybody has the luxury of saying about them, to hell with them. They're backwards, or they're assimilated, or they're medieval, or they're ignorant, or whatever the case may be, and I don't care what happens to them. The Jews have never, ever, ever done that before. We've argued about a lot of things, and Hasidim and Mitnagdim did not eat each other's slaughtered meat, and they often didn't want their children to marry each other, but they understood at the end of the day that their fates were intertwined no matter what they disagreed about. And we're getting to the point where we have forgotten that. And let's just be really honest. What's happening in Europe is chilling. And if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, nobody would be able to think of a time when people got shot in a synagogue or a synagogue got burnt down. And if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, nobody would have been able to think of a time that the House of Representatives couldn't pass a resolution on anti-Semitism. Things are changing. And anybody who imagines that they know where this is going is, to quote the sage, a damn fool. None of us know where this is going. Tom's right about that with the Trump thing, and I think we're both right about this. This is scary stuff. And at this moment, we should do what Jews have done for thousands of years, which is to understand that despite our grave differences, We actually need each other desperately. And the way to fix this is to first understand how the other sees the other through different lenses and begin a conversation. That was the point of the book. If the book leads people to begin to think about the other side of the ocean differently, more magnanimously, more openly, even if we don't agree, but we walk away saying, despite the differences, I think we need to make this work, that, for me at least, will have made the book a success.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.